That's very important for us. We want to welcome you to another team housing workshop, and we are honored and blessed to have a key presenter tonight and return of independent team consultant Savannah Nicole, who will be helping facilitating and moderating. And Lily will bring us home tonight. Lily and myself, I'm David Morgan, and Lily McKenzie, we work at Team, and you're going to hear a lot about tonight's presenters. Let me share my screen. And so again, welcome to the team series. Tonight, by big demand, was a piece from the public at large on affordable housing MythBusters. And this is going to be a multi-part series. There's a lot to cover, a lot to dive into, and we're really excited to start that this evening as the beginning of this Q&A, and our hope is to have future dialogue with other stakeholders as well. And a reminder that our last workshop was around our town has an affordable housing plan. Now what do you do? And we have a list here of other housing workshops from public demand that we'll be focusing in on the work ahead going into 2024 as well, from increasing home ownership and opportunities to tenant-landlord relationships, including landlord absenteeism, economic development, gainful employment and opportunity, and how municipalities recognize it or not, they're competing with one another. And their pathway to success is addressing the housing or the housing shortage, the shortage of homes. And it's very doable right here in Team's region, and it's very doable throughout the state of Connecticut. And then a future piece on builders and property development. And we have a key builder who will be speaking at our team breakfast next month as to every economic development project must have a focus on affordable housing options in order to see that type of success. And then we're going to dive a little deeper on housing and zoning. And then housing policy is education policy, and housing policy does equate to population level health and wellness. And then also a piece on transit-oriented housing and development. Quick refresher for those that joined us, and we have it recorded, and Lily will walk you through how to find that. Many have found it and used the recording. It makes my heart happy and all of us at Team Inc. to hear that these videos have been watched and used by zoning commissioners, residents, other thought partners, and stakeholders within our towns and cities, and we make them very accessible. John Guskowski dove into the areas of zoning strategy and some key strategies around working with towns and the affordable housing plans, whether you have one written or how to get to the goal of writing one, and how it can really be a blueprint for your town or city to thrive. And it is only possible by getting all the folks at the table to develop that plan. And he even included a bonus strategy in that recording around how affordable housing plans. Jocelyn really shined the light on some exemplars in other communities in the town. Forgive the blurry photo there. And we also, from Jocelyn and John work and Savannah Nicole's facilitation, and Lily will point it to you on our website. In this there's a document. Don't try to remember all this. We'll actually distribute the document of this. But when you really think about the ideal composition of an affordable housing committee specific to each town and city, you see the footprint of Team's communities where we do direct work within housing, not only addressing housing needs and challenges and opportunities, but also trying to increase education, understanding, and sensitivity to what we're talking about when we say these words, affordable housing. And so you can see this is a really great, we have a formal document that we put on our website, authored by experts. And again, Savannah Nicole as an independent consultant at Team and myself working with that consultation, put that document together, and very excited to see it put to use at the local level. And we encourage you that if this can be a good conversation starter, to take it and run with it, where you think about this public-private, comprehensive sector when we try to build things within communities where we live and work and mean so close to us, all of these different representatives at the table to implement those affordable housing plans as a really high quality next step from the first workshop. We also heard from Jenny Rice, a key leader in the growing All-In movement, a founder of the All-In for Seymour, is working very meaningfully independently as well as a consultant with Team Inc. And in part of that workshop, Jenny really hit it home on the art and science of building stronger communities in connecting people, and how we create those environments where the stories can be heard, where we can proof point the needs and wants within towns and cities, and when we all bring people to the table, when we can truly build these solutions and co-create these solutions together, it really is a very powerful realization when we own what we make. And again, Jenny's piece is in that recording as well. And this is a snapshot. There was a lot of images and some narrative on the All In movement. We had some key leaders who are contacted after the workshop, and we encourage you. Lily's going to share more with you on how you can, reach out to local All In alliances. Yeah, from Milford to Seymour, Shelton, Oxford, Seymour, Shelton, Ansonia, Derby, and so on throughout Team's region, and anything we can do to support or nudge you to connect with the All In movement. Team is just honored to be a nonprofit ally, along with many others in the public and private sector, with this work of co-creating these solutions, including but not limited to increasing the supply of housing options. And you can see a snapshot of a lot of the different meaningful involvement, from mayors to first select people to residents, P&Z, finance boards, boards of education, superintendents, corporate CEOs, builders, and developers, and really having these deep dives into these three core elements around All In. And again, Lily will point you on how you can reach out directly and be part of the work and part of the solution with the All In movement. This is a snapshot, a one pager of all the Team's programs. Just a reminder, and my goal here is to just give you a very brief tasting of the work we do within housing assistance. And we do a lot of work with eviction assistance and arrearages. We also do a lot of work with security deposit. We do budget and planning, tenant and landlord communication, mediation, and comprehensive holistic care management, referrals and linkages. There is a landscape of public and private and nonprofit providers partnering with individuals and families and households from all walks of life. And I would be remiss not to point out to you that the number one challenge bearing down through no fault of people's own is the rising cost of the roof over their head as homeowners and renters. And just in the last year alone, we saw an 81% increase in the number of people turning to Team for help with housing assistance. I'll give you another snapshot on data. This is specific to the home heating assistance program, which runs from approximately September 1st to approximately the end of May each year. We are just entering the new season this year as we try to reach out to disabled, older adults, individuals that it would be much more feasible to work with them and not wait for the snow and the weather elements to land on the ground. But we like to hold the mirror up to the community and just share the facts. And we saw a 29.2% increase in the number of applications that turned to Team from these 10 towns, from Beacon Falls to Milford and all the communities you see here. Just for help with home heating assistance. That is an unprecedented increase, and we would be remiss not to share that as one piece and element when we think about homeowners and renters. ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, one of multiple coronavirus relief packages and funding supports, and not only in responding immediately to the devastating impacts of COVID-19, but also where we are now as at the state and federal level have sunsetted the public health emergency this past May. But we all know the long-term recovery. We have a long road ahead, especially when we think about the social, economic, and environmental impacts of COVID-19. And 94% of the relief that we were able to get directly to households that needed it to the most across all the basic essential quality needs of life. 94%, of every need was specific to the roof over their housing. And it saddens me deeply and it terrifies me deeply to tell you that the money is all gone and has all completely run out. Team is working very hard to find other alternatives and resources. But unfortunately, the pendulum, amidst that, we are seeing a need like we've never seen before. Again, people from all walks of life in severe crisis and stress around having a home that is safe and decent for themselves and their loved ones. And it transcends all social and economic income levels, and it's terrifying. couple of numbers right behind that. So when you look at the fair market rate for a 2-bedroom apartment right here in Connecticut, and remember, this is a data point. A lot of the reality, anecdotally, are higher than these numbers I'm showing you. But you look at the fair market rate for a 2-bedroom apartment right here in Connecticut is $1,660 a month. If you want to look at a 1-bedroom apartment fair market rate, it's $1,347. And if you quantified that into a full-timer working 40 hours a week, their hourly wage to stay below 30% of their income, that means not spending more than 30 cents for every dollar they're working their butts off for the roof over their head. Once they start spending more than 30 cents to every dollar they work for the roof over their head, difficult decisions and choices, or the lack of choices, are happening. Buying the prescription medication, paying for the transportation costs, children and childcare if you have children, paying your taxes. You would have to be making $31.93 an hour for a 2-bedroom apartment unit. And on the bottom, we put a data point here for you for a 1-bedroom fair market rate in Connecticut, just under $26 an hour. And again, in the last year, showing you some of the data around housing for team as the number one issue, and the significant increase in the number of individuals, more than 15,000 that came to team's door across those communities in the last year alone. When we talk about wages and housing wage, as we call, who are we talking about? The list is a lot longer than this one. Wanted to keep it to one page. We're talking about our retail and hospitality workers, our security workers, our wait staff, our cooks, restaurants, bar workers, entry-level healthcare workers, healthcare aides, home health and personal care aides, nursing assistants, emergency first responders, childcare workers, our public school entry-level teachers, teaching assistants, paraeducators, bookkeepers, paralegals, accounting staff, auditing clerks, receptionists, office clerks, customer service reps, maintenance and repair workers, manufacturing workers. I've shared this story 3 times. I'm going to share it 4 times today. Right here in one of our communities, a major private CEO in Seymour, right in Teams region, had 8 workers approach them in the last 12 months saying, can I borrow off of my pension? Can I get paid in lieu of taking my vacation time off? All 8 of them, when asked what's going on, it was they were cost burdened. They were paying far too much for the roof over their head, far more than 30 cents for every dollar they're working their butts off. That's just one story behind the data. And then I'm going to close up and show you right here in Teams region, from Oxford, Beacon Falls, Bethany, Seymour, Woodbridge, Shelton, Ansonia, Derby, Orange, Milford, right here, images of what we call affordable housing. Every single image, I'm going to protect your time and our time. I'm not going to quiz you on asking you, do you think this is affordable housing or not? The answer is every one of these images you see on this screen are affordable housing premises in Milford, Woodbridge. Again, all those communities I shared, all of these are affordable housing. I share these because we not only need to increase the supply and the menu of options for affordable housing, we equally importantly need to increase understanding and sensitivity to the issue of what we're talking about when we say affordable housing. And we still continue to struggle with outdated, forgive my candor, but outdated, stigmatized thinking, decades and years in the making. And so again, these are all images of affordable housing. And from, I'm going to stop my screen, sorry, walking and chewing bubblegum. So it's my pleasure to turn it over to Savannah Nicole tonight, our moderator for tonight, and who's going to really monitor the audience. We encourage you to, in real time, submit questions and answers. Savannah Nicole is really a leading expert in this work, not only an independent consultant with Team Inc. on housing, a dear friend and a teacher for me in the work at Team Inc., but also works with the Naugatuck Valley Council of Governments. She's the community planning director there, and does a lot of work in supporting and teaching municipalities with housing, prescriptions, land use administration, and again, in my humble opinion, is the leading expert. And the last thing I'll say is that the housing panel, that the architect behind the housing panel of the Envision conference right at the end of last year, this is the key conductor and the key architect behind that work, Savannah Nicole. So please, Savannah Nicole.
Thank you so much, David. You speak so kindly of everybody, and it's wonderful. Yeah. You make my heart warm. And I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. I bet everyone in this audience has a moment where they can think about where you made their heart feel warm.
That's
So
enough. Time's ticking.
But thank you so much. And also thank you to everybody who is taking time out of your lives to attend. We understand that this is difficult, to points David highlighted, whether you work a third shift, whether you have children at home, whether you have families you're taking care of. There's a lot of stuff that can make this side of the community involvement process difficult. So whether you're here right now or you're watching at a later point, we're really, really, really happy that you're here. It's really great to see how many people are interested in this topic. And so we're just excited. So for people who were at the first workshop, welcome back. For those that are here for the first one, welcome here. We're really happy to have you. We look forward to you becoming a regular at future workshops. And before I really get into the presentation, I just want to call to attention how unique that this space truly is. First and foremost, and I think that David and Lily would agree, this is a community space. These sessions are really meant to support and facilitate your understanding of housing. Whether you're a policy wonk who really gets housing, or you're someone where this is just your introduction, this is a space for everybody along the continuum. And so whether you have a question you think is big or small, or you're not sure if you should ask it, please ask it. With John and myself and the rest of the team, we're here to be a resource. If we can answer a question on the spot, we will. If we can't, we'll get back to you. It's a priority that we can help facilitate your understanding, no matter where it is in these processes. And so with that being said, the information shared today and previous sessions and in future sessions, it's always going to be used differently. Today, we're hoping that you'll leave feeling more comfortable myth busting common misconceptions around housing. And for some people, that's going to be at the dinner table. And for some people, that's going to be at a municipal meeting. But to be frank, we need those conversations in those places and every single place in between to truly activate change. So as stated, today is about the first of many on myth busting affordable housing. What's it really mean? How do we get into the nuts and bolts of this? So I always like to define key terms before getting into a conversation. I think that it sets us on the same ground and helps be sure that we all can engage in the conversation from the same place. So the first term I want to cover is housing affordability. This term is used on the national, state, and local level. So when people are talking about housing affordability, they're talking about housing for which households, individuals, families, everyone in between, pay 30% or less of their income on housing costs. It hones in on David's point. You're spending 30 cents per dollar on housing costs. When a household is spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs, they're considered cost burdened. If a household is spending more than 50%, so 50 cents per dollar, they're considered severely cost burdened. And the reason why being cost burdened really matters, and David said it, but again, I think repetition is really important to hone in on some of these points. If you don't have money to pay for housing, you're really going to struggle when it comes to food, transportation, healthcare, childcare. You have to make decisions that can impact your livelihood, your family's livelihood. It's a ripple effect that does have impacts on your community, your home, your family, your unit, as well as the broader communities that you're participating in. And that matters on the community level, whether it leads to perspectives being left out of conversations because they can't participate, they don't have the capacity or space to do so, or less dollars, less voices, less vibrancy in your communities. It's the involvement of everybody that really makes your community, your space unique. We'll now go over the difference between affordable housing and naturally occurring affordable housing. John will also touch upon this in his presentation a bit, but we want to start here. So both affordable and naturally occurring affordable housing are housing options that do have affordability as a component. However, it's really important to note that only the affordable housing that is maintained through a housing subsidy or affordability restriction is going to be protected from market forces. And we really, really saw that during COVID. And you can see that through the data points that David and Lily and team share, that when there's not a subsidy protecting individuals, households, families that are in units, if the demand goes up or the supply isn't sufficient for the supply of units is not sufficient for the community, you're going to see these prices continue to skyrocket. And COVID was a time where I think that it was really illuminated to a lot of people. John's going to bust that myth a little bit later, but I think that really brought a larger community consensus around the problem. But it's that subsidy. That's the key difference here, is that those households that are in affordable housing through restriction or voucher, or whatever it may be, they're really going to be protected from those market forces, those things we can't account for. And then finally, the last two terms I want to cover aren't really related to this conversation, but they're the two broad and most common policy mechanisms that we hear discussed in housing conversations in the state. The Affordable Housing Plan is one that we discussed in depth at the last session. So instead of talking your ear off there, I will encourage you to watch that if you have not done so already. But I will highlight one point. In the last legislative session, there was an additional requirement added to affordable housing plans. So when your community prepares to adopt a new plan after this time period's up, or if your community has not adopted a plan yet, if your plan is not adopted by October 1st, your plan also will need to address how your municipality intends to improve the accessibility of affordable housing units for individuals with intellectual disabilities or other developmental disabilities. And so if your plan is set, it's just something to consider. It's something we should all keep in our minds, but you will have to implement that additional element in your future plan updates. And as John knows, him and I could probably talk about 830G till the cows came home. We would talk to you late into the night. And so if a workshop on 830G, so the regulatory process to build state designated affordable housing, if you've heard that term, if that term scares you, if you're not really sure what it means, but you have a connotation from the ways that you've heard that term being used, please let us know if a workshop would be beneficial into that space. There are a lot of people who can help you understand what it really is, what it isn't, and how it can be used by a community, by a developer. It's just it's an important conversation. So if you're hearing negative things, I just ask you hold out and you email Lily and tell her, I really want that workshop. All righty. So again, we're really, really excited for everybody that's here today. You continue to show that understanding the complexities of what's this housing problem? What's it really mean? How do we solve it? How do we move forward on it? You show that it is a priority in the region. It's more than just a data point. You take the time out of your lives to be here today. You're taking the time out of your life to watch us in the future. And we're really, really, really appreciative of that. But lucky for us, now it's my turn to be the David. We have an incredibly skilled practitioner here today who cares very deeply about this issue, but I consider one of the leading people in the state, the person that I learn what I learned from, the one that I go to when I'm not sure or I'm scared. And so we're in incredible company. We're very lucky to have John with us today. So John Cabral is the director at the Connecticut Project. In his role, John works to empower our communities and neighbors by working closely with residents, partners, and policymakers on housing and community development. And prior to being at the Connecticut Project, John worked at the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. So he's both the community facilitator and discussion, but he's that policy wonk too. So we get the best of both worlds, where he investigated the intersection of housing policy, planning, and economics. And during his time at the authority, John worked with a variety of partners in developing and managing affordable and community development initiatives. He's a certified planner and an adjunct professor at Central Connecticut State University and a visiting lecturer at Trinity College. So with that, I will hand it off to John to lead us into the next part of the presentation.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Savannah Nicole. You warm my heart. So you always do such a great job with these things. And the idea of mentoring, being a mentor is special, but in particular for you, it's really special. So I tend to learn a lot more from you, actually. So anyway, I'm glad to be here. And by the way, I own more than one shirt. It looks like the photo in the picture was the same shirt I'm wearing today, but I swear I have more than one color shirt. So yeah, my name is John Cabral. I'm with the Connecticut Project, have worked in the affordable housing space now for a very long time. And it's really truly a passion of mine. So I'm happy to be here and want to thank Dave and his team as well. So we'll talk a little bit about give a little context around the affordable housing space and start busting some myths. All right. So one of the things I've heard, especially over the last couple of years, whether I worked at CHFA and now at the Connecticut Project, from a number of folks and policymakers, is the fact that they think the housing crisis is as a result of COVID, and that now that we're going back to a normal or market, that the housing crisis will sort of resolve itself, especially as maybe rates go up. But that's, I think, not really completely an accurate picture. So we'll start by giving a little context, modern context of housing and affordable housing. So a little policy wonky, but bear with me. And we'll be talking about sort of three eras when it comes to sort of the modern housing policy and how the federal government, state government, and even the private sector has addressed housing in communities throughout the country. So we'll start with sort of the sort of Great Depression era of housing. So for most, this may come as a surprise, but for a good chunk of our American history, up and through to the Great Depression, most Americans were actually renters. They weren't actually homeowners, and that's the case throughout the whole entire country. And during this period, there really wasn't much housing policy, let's say on the federal side. It was really left to the states. And states at the time essentially left it up to the market and to certain local communities. So the federal government really didn't play a role in affordable housing policy. And to be quite frank, many states really didn't play a role in housing policy. And so it was sort of left to the market. And that resulted in some interesting housing, a lot of it fairly substandard, and particularly in some of the communities that saw lots of immigrants come in to work in factories. And we really saw substandard housing, for affordable housing being a real issue, overcrowding. And this really came to the forefront in the American mind in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially with the photojournalist Jacob Riis shedding light on tenement housing and tenement conditions in New York City. Released a photo book called How the Other Half Works. And this was, or rather, How the Other Half Lives. And this was really showed the real housing conditions for many Americans, especially in our cities, factory workers and so on and so forth. So here's a picture from that book, and you could see, and Savannah, of course you'd have a copy of it. And what's interesting in this photo, and Savannah, Nicole, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but what's really interesting is, so this is not just one family, these are multiple families living together, and folks essentially rented space in the house and would pay different amounts depending on where you slept. So if you wanted to, let's say, sleep on the top bunk, you paid a little bit more than folks who slept on the floor. This was not great housing. And it was really at this point, Americans really said, okay, enough's enough. We really need to address housing. And we started seeing some movement, even through the Great Depression, on changing the housing issues. Great Depression hits, and now all of a sudden people start having significant issues with losing their homes, right? So up until this point, if you were lucky enough to be a homeowner, you either purchase your house by just buying it cash, or you did go to a bank and get a loan, and that loan wasn't necessarily guaranteed. You may have had a 10-year mortgage, but the bank could call the bank note at any point. And with the Great Depression and runs on banks called their loans back. And a number of families were left stranded, really were left having to turn in their keys and were foreclosed on. Banks took back homes as they tried to pay back their deposit, folks who were put deposits in the bank. So federal government really had to step in and played a much larger role in housing. This was really the New Deal. I'm sure many folks here may have heard of the New Deal, but maybe not understood the impact of the New Deal had in housing. And so for the first time now, we're seeing the definition of what affordable housing is. So Savannah Nicole defined affordable housing, but it was really during this era that the federal government defined it as 30% of your income. That was viewed as, that or below was viewed as affordable. Up until this point, that was not something that folks necessarily thought. Federal government also began to play a bigger role in the just mortgage sector and develop the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So they guaranteed the mortgages. They told banks, look, you can make the mortgage, You can make mortgages, make 30-year mortgages. We'll purchase those mortgages to add liquidity to you, so you can keep on making more mortgages, and you don't have to call back those notes, right? So folks, families had now a guarantee that they wouldn't necessarily be thrown out if the bank called back their mortgage. And that was when we saw the agencies like Fannie Mae come to play a larger role. And we start seeing the shift from Americans being primarily renters to now becoming homeowners. And this was really the beginning of the American dream as we know it, right? Folks being able to purchase their own home, being able to move into suburban communities after World War II, and build wealth. Unfortunately, though, that opportunity was not necessarily open to everyone. And this was also the beginning of the era when we saw significant redlining. For those who may not be familiar with redlining, but it really is the practice in which at one point it actually was literally lenders drawing red lines around communities, saying that we don't necessarily want to invest in those communities. We don't necessarily want to make mortgages in those communities. We'll take deposits from the folks who live there, but we won't necessarily lend to mostly low-income brown communities in urban centers. So you really started seeing a significant disinvestment in cities in our urban core, and in actually many suburban communities that had lots of workers and folks who were deemed to be not worthy of, let's say, home ownership. It was really fairly tragic, and Connecticut dealt with this as well. So here's just an example of a document that was part of a redline document in the Hartford area, where they the federal government did these analyses, which were shared with banks, on whether they should be lending in, I believe this is actually a neighborhood in the city of Hartford. And you can see, right, this is a really good example of how they measured what was viewed as a high-risk community, in this case, a slum area. And you see here, there's really no indication of investment or like even how the housing stock is. It's really based on demographics, right? What folks' main occupations are, estimated annual income, but more interestingly enough, how many folks were foreign born. In this case, 34% of families in this neighborhood were Italian, and the percentage of families that were African American. So these were used to determine whether the federal government and whether banks would make mortgages in many communities. And we saw the significant disinvestment, right? So we saw even not only an affordability issue in these communities, but then we saw deterioration of that housing. And then this brings us to sort of the most recent era in sort of housing policy. So starting around the Nixon administration, so after we've went through years and years of having New Deal presidents, we saw really a transition in the early 70s of this idea of having the market determine or solve the affordable housing crisis and decentralizing housing policy. So housing policy went back to the states. Federal government cut direct spending to housing, and this is when you start seeing federal housing really go south, right? Really having some significant issues, and you saw state governments take control of housing policy. Some did better jobs than others, but you saw this era in which the private sector then would be more involved. So this idea of not investing in building more housing, but maybe providing vouchers or using the tax code, especially in the 80s, tax reform to solve for affordable housing.
John, this is awesome.
Yeah.
It is not awesome, the history. It is awesome information that you were providing. I want to be abundantly clear.
Yeah.
But along this line, I want to provide a little antidote that I hope will be beneficial and then prompt you a bit. This stuff, if you're not a history person, it can be pretty overwhelming. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of dense information. It's a lot of dates and acts that led to implementation errors and incongruencies. And so I've been in instances, especially I want to be clear that you don't reach a point where you understand housing policy and you feel confident in all spaces to interact or interface when you think someone is incorrectly representing, or they have a misunderstanding of what the housing policy is. And so one thing I'll say is, I encourage you to speak up, even when you're not sure, even when your answer just lies at, I don't think that's right. I remember differently. I can't give you a date. I can't give you a policy right now, but that doesn't track with the way that I remember hearing about this, or I remember learning about it. We have to hold each other accountable in our communities, and when we let misinformation in all accounts spread, it makes this conversation even more difficult. So, John, I've got two questions for you. The first is, do you have any advice for people who want to better understand housing policy? Any books that come to mind, any videos, any things of that nature that people can engage with? And then do you have also, kind of to what I said, but if someone hears that something doesn't track with their understanding, what do you recommend they do? How would you handle those sorts of moments?
Yeah, great question. And I'm gonna raise up the point that I've been in this space for decades, and I have not met anyone who understands all of this. Right? This is multifaceted. This is complex. While I, as you may have claimed I'm an expert in affordable housing, I would say I understand it more maybe than the average person, but I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an expert because there are very few experts. And even in that space, right, I don't know, I'm not as familiar with, let's say, homeless housing versus affordable housing. There's just so many facets of it. So I'm constantly learning and constantly reading. And, I would say one of the, for those who want to learn more, I think one of the interesting things is I think the country's finally waking up to the fact that we have an affordable housing issue. And there are plenty of great articles out there. Connecticut Mirror writes articles frequently about the housing crisis. New York Times even writes some really interesting pieces. Fairly recently, actually wrote an interesting piece looking out internationally and how we can learn from folks. You're constantly going to be learning, and there's just so many great resources out there. Organization like the Partnership for Strong Communities here in Connecticut, they're constantly get on their list, right? Get on their, they're always sending great articles out and doing iForums that are oftentimes virtual, that in which you can learn about housing. And then for books, again, a lot of great folks are writing about this. There's a gentleman by the name of Alan Malik, who, for folks who do planning, probably know him better, but he has worked in this area for years and writes about the deterioration of community and in housing. And then I think one of the best books, of which I happen to have here, Savannah, I'm going to put
I have it too. I know what you're going to pull out.
The Color of Law. I would suggest this. I did not write this, but obviously Richard Rothstein. There you go. We both have a copy. He, it's fascinating that he is actually an education policy wonk, right? So to David's point, where education policy and housing policy, they're both, overlap so well. He was just interested in what was happening in education, and realized that all roads left sort of led him to housing, and wrote this wonderful book that gave a great history about housing, saw what the policy implications and what the legacy we're living with is. So yeah, just be curious. And for those, if you get a question you don't know the answer, I think simply not, saying, look, that doesn't sound right, I need to do a little more research, is important. But anyone you meet who says they know it all, probably, I can guarantee you, doesn't. Yeah.
And we have another question from Corinne that if we can get to it, if we can answer it shortly and then follow up, I think that'll be our best bet. And Corinne, we can also give you resources as well. But Corinne's question is it true that federal government cuts on housing spending started under the Nixon administration as part of the backlash to the war on poverty? I want you to give an answer that gets to it, but Corinne, I promise we'll send you some resources as well.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, and quickly, the first part of the Nixon administration, surprisingly enough, Richard Nixon actually spent more in affordable housing than any other president. And that shifted when he had a presidential housing committee commission that suggested shifting resources. So it's really funny that in many sense, early on in his administration, he was one of the New Deal, lots of money into housing, and that shifted quickly. So I think it's more complex than that, but I would say that yes, there's definitely a shift in the way we dealt with poverty during that era. So I'll move on to the next slide. And very cool. I hear all the time. Connecticut's population has largely stayed the same. There is no need to build more housing. I wish I had a nickel for every time I've heard this in all the years I've worked in affordable housing. And to be honest with you, when I first got this question early on in my career, I thought, like, well, that's an interesting point. But it's much more complex. Like anything else, demographics are really complex. So while it's true that the state's population has largely stayed, fairly stagnant over last decade or so, with some modest, moderate growth, the number of households has actually grown. So this is not unique to Connecticut. This is actually a national trend, and actually a somewhat international trend. We actually see smaller households, but we see more households. So a couple of perfect examples of this is over the last number of years, we've seen millennials living with their parents, and they've stayed with their parents because of the cost of housing, and often because they're highly debt burdened from school. And now we're seeing those millennials who, some of them have recently turned 40. Won't put myself in that category, but older millennials who've turned 40 who are looking now to move out of their parents' home or no longer have a roommate. They're looking for housing now. And while they didn't necessarily increase the population of the state, they've lived here all their lives, they now need a home. And so you're seeing more demand for housing. You're just seeing smaller households. You're seeing folks who are one-person households. That's very common. Empty nesters who now are smaller households, or folks who actually may have delayed divorce even through the financial crisis and early on in the 2008 through more recently. So we're seeing this increase in households. While population isn't necessarily growing significantly, we're seeing significant jumps in households. So that's putting a large, significant burden on the housing stock. So it doesn't take much. And so with that being said, we're also seeing, and the data hasn't quite caught up to the time, but we are seeing some immigration from places like New York City as well. And so places like Fairfield County in particular have been impacted by those New Yorkers who are looking for more affordable options. And as an economist told me once, it doesn't take much migration to a place like Fairfield County to throw off the housing market, right? You empty one Manhattan building and dump those folks into Connecticut, and you completely throw off the housing market. It doesn't take much. We were tight on stock anyway. Now it's gotten worse. So we're an aging state as well. We're seeing needs of older folks, and because of that, some folks want to downsize, want to maybe move to smaller homes or condos, and the stock just isn't available. So we're seeing again these pressures on various parts of the market. We're also seeing, also not unique to Connecticut, but an issue here in Connecticut. We do see a concentration of subsidized housing in urban centers, which has led to economic and racial segregation. So, like in the book, The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein goes into great detail about this and how this was really a policy that started with the New Deal and has continued. Some policies that were well-intentioned that led to segregation. Some of them which were very intentional that have led to segregation. And we in Connecticut still live with that legacy. Rural parts of the state have seen some population decline. I would say that while the census has shown this, it's hard to tell whether that's still the case. COVID has really thrown things through a loop, and the census data hasn't quite caught up, right? We're playing catch up on understanding what's actually happening in those markets. When we look at the home ownership rate of African Americans compared to white nutmeggers, we see a significant difference, right? We see, and again, not unique to Connecticut, but we do see this significant difference between home ownership being a mostly white suburban thing, versus versus for African Americans, and this sort of perpetuates itself, right? So one of the things that the New Deal did was provide lots of programs, lots of support for folks to purchase their home. Those families then built wealth through their homes, and those parents provided some of that equity from their home for their children to buy their home, right? And African Americans were left out of that, and so we're seeing this. Actually, we've seen a decline in the home ownership rate amongst African Americans since the Great Recession. So again, these are policy issues that were made, 60 years ago, that we live with those legacies. So it wasn't always this way. It's become this way over time. And it's also important to understand that Connecticut has become a much more diverse state. And the last census has shown that. So these are issues that we as a state and even in the Naugatuck Valley and Milford have have also dealt with. We're a small state, so we have lots of different housing markets, right? And I think COVID showed this as well. We're a small state, but when you go from Fairfield County to New London up to Windham County, you're going to see lots of different costs, different housing markets, and these things change with time, right? So Connecticut has been slow, and again, probably isn't a surprise to most folks, but we were slow in the recovery out of the Great Recession. While I think one of the things that isn't necessarily talked about frequently is the fact that we didn't see the drastic drops in home values and home prices early on in the Great Recession. But we didn't recover quickly either. So we're fairly flat. We dipped and we're slow to recover. And it wasn't until really COVID that we saw actually some of the numbers go back to what they once were. So it stayed slow to recover. We've for decades have had a low supply of housing. Really since the early 1990s, late 1980s, really, since the savings and loan crisis, Connecticut really hasn't built much housing. Yes, you might see, building in your community here and there, but when you look at the state as a whole, when you look at whole regions, not just, that building that happened to be built across the street, there really isn't as much housing being built. And there hasn't been housing built at the scale that was required for the last 30 plus years. And again, we're now living with that, right? That is what we're dealing with today. And that comes through when it comes to vacancy rates, especially for the rental side, right? So Connecticut, up until recently, I think it still may be the case, has the lowest vacancy rates, or rather I should say, the lowest vacancy rates in the country, right? We see 2% vacancy rates in certain communities. So there isn't enough housing stock, and landlords, it's economics, right? When there are low vacancy rates, rents go up. There's more demand for that housing, and we're dealing with that. And parts of the state have seen significant rent increases, significant home prices year over year. And a place like New London County, for example, which has always been one of the more affordable corners of the state, is seeing significant rent increases, sometimes some as high as 12-15% year over year rent increases. So yeah, it's we really truly have an affordable housing crisis in the state. Just want to touch on the housing stock. It's sort of important. So we are an older state. Not only is our population older, but our buildings are older, right? So if you look at the median age of the housing stock in Connecticut, it's 57 years versus 45 years when you look at the country as a whole. So we have an older housing stock, which requires a lot more TLC. And because of that, again, while we're not building lots of housing, we're also seeing some housing coming off the market because it's just gotten to a point where it's not inhabitable anymore. So this is, again, an issue that's an urban core issue, but it's also a rural issue.
Don, can I this? We have a great question that I think relates to this and everything from Jen. In my field, many comments are similar to the system is broken. Is the system broken, underfunded, or misaligned? All of the above?
That's a really good question. I'm going to say it's all of the above. I think there is some misalignment, right? There are dollars out there. There are some dollars out there that really help with affordable housing, but they could be better utilized maybe somewhere else. The system's being broken there. It's interesting enough and I was just about to bring up this point when it comes to the most affordable housing stock is sort of the small multifamily, naturally occurring affordable housing stock, like in some of these pictures here that I have on my slide. But what COVID proved is you can't rely on your naturally occurring affordable housing as your affordable housing stock, because markets change so quickly, right? And the reality is, while this is the most common source of affordable housing in the state, and I would say in the country, there are very little resources for landlords or for tenants in homes like these, right? Landlords who own a 3-4 family home don't necessarily have the resources to keep their units affordable if something goes wrong compared to some of the larger developers. So again, the system isn't quite aligned, and it is broken. And I think there's so much more focus on it, but it's a really tough nut to crack. So I don't know if I answered, but yeah, it's super complex, and this is why we're here, right? We're trying to, one brick at a time, we're trying to figure it out. And as I said, construction has remained fairly low since the 1990s, but I do want to emphasize the fact that the importance of the small multifamily property as being super important when it comes to affordability. It's where most folks find the most affordable options. And according to some estimates, we have a shortfall in the state of about 85,000 affordable housing units. This isn't necessarily to say that we need to build 85,000 new units. It's just how much the shortfall is, which includes building new units and preserving some of the units we have and converting some of the market rate units to be permanently affordable, at least for a period of time while rents go up. So the things, Savannah, Nicole, I'm sure you hear this all the time. The market will solve the housing affordability problem, right? Leave it to the market. It will figure it out. And I would say that it's a wonderful sentiment, but it hasn't always been the case. There are lots of barriers to expanding affordable housing. Land use regulation, NIMBYism happens in a number of communities. I know folks on this forum probably have seen it at play, right? Folks who I truly think don't understand or are fearful of what that means. And so they come out and may be against even any sort of development, let alone affordable housing development. We've mentioned the supply inventory issue. There just isn't enough housing units, and there's a growing need for them. Financial tools, as I mentioned in that small multifamily slide, there are great landlords out there who would like to rehab their 3-family home, but they just don't have the dollars and resources to do it. And maybe up until recently, the building's value wasn't enough for them to take out a loan. And if they had taken out a loan, that would have added costs and likely would have been transferred to the tenant, right? So it wouldn't have remained affordable. So financial tools, lots of things need to be tweaked there. Lack of public infrastructure, we hear this a lot, especially when it comes to even like public transportation and some of the issues that result in the lack of that. High costs since COVID. We've seen labor shortages. We've seen supply issues. So even building affordable housing is so much more costly, and communities really have to deal with that. I think some of those costs are going down, but they're going down very slowly, and there is a real demand and need for it. So we're seeing that. So I mentioned the workforce. Competing interests. There are lots of policies out there around housing, affordable housing, and there are competing interests, and they don't always align, which sometimes slows things down. And then this commodification of housing, this idea of looking at housing as an asset. I think it's really important to understand housing as an asset, but I think first and foremost, we have to think of housing as a roof over your head. It's shelter. And because of that, oftentimes we see folks not necessarily want to see more housing in their community because they want to, they think it's a commodity and they want to keep it scarce and this and that. And that's not going to be good for anybody, because eventually you have to deal with the community implications of that, right? The fact that by not having enough affordable housing, you're not going to have teachers who are able to live in your community, or police officers, or your own children who can afford to live in the community that you raised folks in. So as I touched a little bit about this in Savannah, Nicole, you probably should be you should be the one presenting this slide as a planner, but land use regulation is a barrier in many communities to developing more affordable housing. And so, looking at minimal lot sizes and seeing how that impacts the cost of developing housing, right? So one unit for every acre, half acre of land, that adds a lot of costs. And I have, in my own experience, seen good affordable housing projects get really expensive because lots of land needs to be purchased. And so there's just lots of unused land with a building in the middle of it. It's very strange. Parking mandates. Again, I think especially since COVID, I think folks need to rethink how people work, how people shop, and parking mandates may be something, so maybe a relic of the past, I think, and really needs to be dealt with. Prohibition of building types. What I find most fascinating is the number of folks who go to great cities and come back saying, "Oh God, I loved going to this city and that city. It was walkable. I loved all the townhouses. I loved," yet those are folks who live in communities that don't allow for any of that, right? And that's a real shame. So understanding what's even allowed to be built, and what consumers today want, right? What maybe new millennials or Gen Zers now would like in their housing. Height limits, high impact fees, site plan reviews. These are all things I think are important, but I think really need to be viewed differently and thought differently when it comes to providing housing for folks. So just wanted to bring this up. This is a slide from earlier in the summer. Again, markets change quickly. So I know there's been some articles around how some costs have come down in some markets, but this is a map of the region and looking at the change of homes on the market. This is to purchase a home, comparing, I think it was June of 2022 compared to June of 2023. And you can see that there are significant drops in the number of units actually for sale in the housing market, right? And this is likely because, again, there's a high demand for units and interest rates are going up. So folks are more reluctant to sell their home because they may have gotten a good rate, right? They don't want to sell their home with a 3% interest rate. And so that just adds to the supply issue and the lack thereof. And we're going to see this, I think, for some time. So Connecticut is, as you can see, compared to our neighbors, is dealing with it at a much higher level. Again, we just don't have the supply of units to meet the demand. Going back to some of the barriers, home purchase loans. These are denials in sort of New Haven County. And oftentimes the narrative is that folks don't have cash. They don't have down payment to purchase their first home. Well, I think we're blessed to live in a state where we actually have significant down payment assistance programs. The Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, my former employer, has a state down payment assistance program, Time to Own, which is a forgivable down payment assistance program for first-time home buyers. And by the way, first-time home buyer, I believe, is anyone who has owned a house in the last 3 years. So if you haven't owned a home in, let's say, 5 years or so, you could qualify as a first-time home buyer. There's some income requirement, limits to that, but income limits are actually fairly high. So these are programs that are out there to help folks with who don't have down payment. So really, when we look at one of the most significant barriers to purchasing a home, it's your debt to income, which really makes a lot of sense considering the cost of housing today and the fact that millennials are the primary folks looking to purchase in the market, and they're also highly, have some significant debt burden, oftentimes because of education or just cost of living so much higher during their sort of young adult life. So again, it's not necessarily cash is the issue, but the debt to income and collateral being number 2, and that's fairly new. And the collateral is being that the cost of the house is more than the value of the house or the perceived value of the house by the bank. So we see here, these are some of the barriers to at least home ownership for many families. Question I get, why we have enough affordable housing in my town. Again, I'm sure you've heard this. Savannah Nicole, I know you've heard this. David, I know you've heard this. So, and I think it's a misnomer. Here's the 830G list. This is the number of communities, or this is the communities in your region that, and then it looks at the percentage of what's deemed affordable. So those homes that are income restricted, those homes that have that are preserved to be affordable, right? These are homes that and apartments that no matter what happens in the market, the rents will still be affordable for their tenants. And you can see on this list that, and this is not unique to your region, this is statewide, there are very few towns that actually have that over 10% or 10% or higher. So 830G list is a really good tool to sort of understand what's the housing needs in your community. It's also a really good a tool to get more affordable housing built in your community. 830G, I think folks need to look at it as more of a tool than a regulatory regulation, because that's not what it is. This is really highlighting how many units in your community are CHFA first-time homebuyer mortgages, are deed restricted to some extent, or have an occupant in it that holds a housing voucher. So just wanted to highlight that in the slide, and this just goes to show you that the numbers in your community and one of your communities. So I want to just highlight some key housing programs. Divided by supply side programs, demand side programs. So supply side programs meaning number of units actually you can deliver. Well, there's a low-income housing tax credit program, which some of you may have heard. It's a federal program that's administered at the state level. This is the program that the federal government heavily relies on to build new affordable housing. It's actually done through the tax code. So it's not a HUD program necessarily. It is actually a Treasury program. And so again, it goes back to this idea of using the private market to solve affordable housing issues. There are the Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston in our area provides a program to banks and to developers to develop more affordable housing. And then there's plenty of state-funded programs, really over the Daniel Malloy administration and the current Lamont administration. There are dollars that are coming through the Department of Housing to build more affordable housing. And then the demand side, we have the housing choice voucher. So folks can rent, rent an apartment that's not necessarily an income restricted apartment and be helped, subsidized with that. The state has its own rental assistance program. And then there's the first time homebuyer program, which I mentioned earlier, which really helps folks, purchase their first home and build equity, build wealth with time. And these are really important programs. And I can't emphasize the power of time to own. And while rates are up, time to own can be a significant, really significant tool that you can use to make purchasing a home more affordable while home prices are high. And it is a forgivable down payment assistance program. Don't know all the specifics, so I won't even try, but look into it and see if you qualify. It's a wonderful program.
We can share information and our follow-up about time to own. But I want you to get to this slide, but we have two really good questions from the audience as well. So let me ask one, and then we'll briefly hit this, and we'll hit the last one, because I think it gets to the point of this slide about it taking a village.
Yeah.
So the first question is from Teresa. She's in the All In for Milford chapter, and she's asking a really key question here. So the question is, I feel like housing is a much more emotional issue. It taps into fear, racism, value. How do we address that? And how do we shift the narrative from housing as a commodity to housing like a utility? Any advice in that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that, it's sort of funny. In some ways, you're right. It's an emotional, it really, hits you emotionally, right? Your home is where your heart is type of thing. I mean, folks live it, right? But in many ways, we've also commodified and financialized it enough where folks just view it as an investment. And because of that, folks sometimes, some key decision makers take the heart out of sort of housing policy. And so it's sort of funny for me. I would say that we have to do a better job of telling folks' story around housing, the importance of stable housing. While I agree that, housing is an asset, right? It is a way to build wealth. It is a way that you can, some folks use it as a nest egg, right? To put their kids through college and that. I think it's really important for folks to understand it's also a place where you go to bed after a hard day's work. So I think I think it's really about narrative change in many cases. So, it's emotional, but I think it's emotional for some folks, and for other folks, especially in the finance world, it's very mechanical. And so it's probably not a very good answer. But I look at like Savannah, Nicole, you can speak to this. The zoning regulations, right? They're so cold in many ways. They don't really get to the living, like how folks experience community. They just look at lot sizes, like the types of buildings that are being built. I mean, those are the things that are very regulatory. And sometimes that tends to be the focus, at least in some communities more than others. But yeah, not the best answer, but I think it's about narrative change.
And leading into that question, we have another leader in our audience. We've got many leaders in our audience, but we have Maybeth from Nest, which is another housing organization that assists in our region. And Maybeth is asking, what are some possible impactful actions that affordable housing advocates may take right now? And I want to hone in. Advocate is organization, but it's also individual. It's also community group. It expands. That definition is it's bigger than I think we all think it is.
Mm-hmm.
So right now, to address and debunk these myths, also what funding opportunities are financial institutions like the Connecticut Project willing to commit to support said efforts? If that's a question to follow up on, John, I can help connect you to Maybeth and on that side of things, but it ties into Teresa's great question. What can we do now? What can the individual do? What can the community do?
So I'm wearing my sticker. I wore my sticker for a reason, actually, when I voted. I think it's really important to be involved locally. I think policymakers, I think advocates, and I mean advocates in a broad sense, who want to see more affordable housing done, I don't know if they really truly understand the power of community, and they haven't done things at a local level. And because housing is very local, going back to that emotional thing, right? It's housing is your neighbor. It's the person lives across town. It's the person lives maybe next door, or in the neighboring town. And so for me, I think coming out in support of projects, coming out in volunteering, if there is a planning and zoning commission seat that's available, going for it, right? Being active, going to the meetings and support. There was a survey done earlier this year, the Connecticut project helped fund, asking community members what they felt about affordable housing. And the majority of folks were very pro affordable housing, right? And what showed me was, I don't think they truly understood, like they understood the need for affordable housing, but they were fearful how it impacted them. And it also showed that it's only a minority of voices that come out against these things that are so loud. And I think we have to come out in equal force in support. So just be active in your local community. And that's one of the reasons why I think the All In movement is so important. And I do want to talk offline about how the Connecticut Project can help raise the voices. And David and I, we've talked about this. It's that work at the local level that I think is the only way we're going to be able to make any sort of things move forward. I think working at the state capitol is great, but all politics are local, and housing is hyper local.
Yes, awesome. And Maybeth, if you want to be connected with John, I can help make that connection. You all can find me easily through Lily and David, but anyone can find me anywhere. I'm always willing to help facilitate when possible. Bob, I owe you a coffee because your question leads us directly into a future session that we want to hold. So I want to bring light to it and just say that I promise you, we're not ignoring you. We really want to get into the nuts and bolts about it. So Bob's question was, is there data or information explaining the correlation between the lack of affordable working family housing in a town and the impact that it has on the businesses within the town and ultimately the overall finances? What about the impact on crime, school performance insurance, mental health, social service needs, etc.? We will 100% get to those in a future myth busting workshop. And then Scott, I also want to just call light to your question and your comment as well. I'm a small builder developer working in a rural suburban area, and the biggest impediment to building more housing and or affordable housing is local regulation. Land development has become uninvestable to private market in outlying rural areas. If we could make more predictable and approvable, private entrepreneurs will come back to the market. Again, these are the type of things we want to touch on. David said it earlier, we're going to have a private developer come engage in that conversation with us. So Scott, if you're interested, you should probably reach out to Lily and David as well. I'll put that call to action out. And with that, John, I don't want to cut you off, but your slide, it's a village. It takes a village. And I'm going to give it back to the leaders of our village, David and Lily, to end us. So thank you so much for your presentation and your knowledge today.
No, thank you. This was awesome. Appreciate it.
Yes, awesome. All right, I'm Lily. I'm going to bring us home tonight with a few closing comments. First, I just want to take a minute and thank Jonathan and Savannah Nicole again for your time, bringing your expertise. I think this conversation was so valuable. I know I learned a lot, and I'm hoping our audience got as much out of tonight as I did. And again, thank you for carving out the time for us tonight to create this presentation. One thing I want to make sure our audience knows, team is here to help you. We are your local community action agency. We're here to help you with a myriad of programs, whether that's housing assistance, access to food, home heating assistance, childcare, elderly services. We have a lot of programs, and we will do everything we can, explore every resource and opportunity to help you with challenges that you're facing in your own life. So I'm going to put an email address here in the chat, and just send us an email that comes actually directly to me, and I will make sure you're connected to our appropriate staff member who will give you a call, do a holistic assessment of what you're going through and figure out how we can help you. Next, I want to go ahead and share my screen to Team's housing page. This is on our website. So this is our housing advocacy page, and we have a lot of great resources on here that might help you understand more about what we can do in our local communities to change and actually make changes and improve the housing situation here in Connecticut. So on the right here, we have resources. You'll find a lot of data from different towns across our region, as well as these out of reach Connecticut statistics are very insightful, talking about the cost of housing, some of the numbers David shared earlier. As you go down this page, you'll see this is a video right to our first housing workshop called Our Town Has an Affordable Housing Plan. Now what? And these are some of the resources that Savannah Nicole shared, and that memo that David shared earlier about establishing that local affordable housing committee. What's a recommended cross-sector of folks to be on that committee to inform decisions that will implement actionable items behind that affordable housing plan. So this is a great one for you to watch if you have some time. We have that housing panel that David sat on, hosted by the NBCOG last year. Again, orchestrated by Savannah Nicole. It's a beautiful conversation. You can watch that. Some of our local all-in leaders. This is last year's team annual meeting. The late great Representative Q Williams sharing about the doability and the stick-to-itiveness that this housing crisis requires, as well as the Commissioner of the State Department of Housing offered some comments. The 2021 Housing Forum and some news, as well as the affordable housing plans that are published from the 10 towns and cities in our region. So you can click these buttons, it'll take you right to your town's affordable housing plan. And I just want to loop back to the top and talk a little bit about the all-in movement. We have resident leaders who are in their local all-in chapters, again, just gathering residents who want to make a difference, and specifically talking about this, about the housing issue in their towns. So they gather conversations. Now they're specifically looking at those affordable housing plans, as well as pushing for the creation of those affordable housing committees to actually put some actionable items behind the plans. And this is how we make a difference in our communities. It's one town at a time, one local decision at a time that's going to inch us forward to a solution here in Connecticut. And so if you want to work with your neighbors and be a part of it, they will gladly welcome you. It takes all of us, takes all of our voices to come together, and out of a collective voice, we can create a change and come up with the best ideas that will take all of our interests and priorities together and find that best solution. So again, these local decisions are so valuable. This is where the rubber hits the road, where we're taking this policy, making that action. So I want to encourage you to reach out to your local chapter. The links are right here, and it will take you to your local website, and directly talk to leaders. If not, you can reach out directly to team, and we'll connect you to those local leaders. October 12th, team is hosting our annual meeting at Racebrook Country Club. We'll have Tom Haynes, a local developer, talking about the critical importance of affordable housing, especially as that relates to economic development. If you, as well as we'll have some time to own resources at that event. That's a critical program right now that I would encourage people to look into and take advantage of while it's available. So that event, you can just go to our homepage at teaminc.org, click that button right there on the homepage. It'll take you to more information about our October 12th event. MythBusters Part 2 will take place November 14th, 6 p.m. right here on Zoom. And we'll expand more about what we talked about tonight, expand on those common misconceptions, some of what Bob brought up about the impact on education, crime, traffic, and how that, those misconceptions on how affordable housing is really affecting our communities. So keep that on your calendars, November 14th. And that's all I got. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. To SN, to Jonathan, again, your time is so valuable, and we appreciate you spending that with us, and our audience for being here tonight and having interest in this critical discussion.
And I'm ready to book club with whoever wants
All
to.
right. Book club, TBD. All right, everybody, have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.